I preached the whole sermon. I thought my PowerPoint was on. Until afterward, my wife said, your PowerPoint was not on. I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, I tried. Now, folks, I want to tell you something. This don't work. If it's not working, if it's not on, you got to get my attention, because I'm not paying attention to this. I'm paying attention to this. I know something's wrong. So get my attention, and then I'll take care of it, because I always forget to look back. But I preached that whole sermon thinking it was on and tried to turn it off, and now I'm embarrassed. But anyway, such it is with electronics. One of these days, I'm going to find someone that can run this thing for me, and I'm not going to have to worry about it. If we've got any volunteers, I'm listening.
I can do it if you couldn't do it.
Well, yeah, that's for sure. I'll turn it over to you, too, if you want it. Do what? It's on? I didn't turn around, I had to look at it. James gives us three types of faith. First of all, there's dead faith. Faith without works is dead. James 2, verses 17, verse 20, and verse 26. Then there is demonic faith. Even the devils believe and tremble. James 2, verse 19. And then there's the working faith. James 2, verse 22. Talking about Abraham, whose faith was working together with his works. Tonight I want to talk about incredible faith. Incredible faith that is based on credible testimony. And we're going to start with looking at the apostles. I want to go to the book of Matthew, chapter 16. And this is kind of going to be where we're going to introduce the topic. In Matthew 16, verse 16 and following, Jesus talks about, or asks the question, who do men say that I am? And they say that you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And finally Jesus said, okay, who do you say that I am? Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. How did he get that? Where did that information come from? What prompted that remark? First of all, it was from hearing his teaching. For about 2.5, 3 years, they heard the teaching of Jesus. In fact, they were so, committed to that in John chapter 6, as Jesus had been preaching to the multitudes, and he said that he was the bread of life, and that if any men were going to see the Father, they had to partake of the bread. Because the hardness of the sayings that he just preached, the majority of the people turned around and left. One day they're going to take him by force and make him king. The next day they leave him standing along with the disciples. Saddened by this response, Jesus asked the disciples, will you go also? Peter's response, Lord, where shall we go? You have the words of life. They were convinced by his teachings. Their faith was based on the teachings. Their faith was based on the miracles. In John chapter 20, 30, 31, and many more signs that Jesus did in the presence of his disciples. But these are written that you might believe. Now John, as he wrote that, said that these had been done in front of the disciples, so it would have created a faith in front of them. Now we have them written in this book to help create faith in us. Faith that he was indeed the Son of God. Faith is grounded. It is a foundation, or founded in truth, reason, knowledge, and evidence. It's not a jump in the dark or a shout in the dark. It is based on solid evidence, knowledge, reason and truth. Now, when the Bible tells us that some of the priests heard Jesus, they believed in him, but out of fear of the Pharisees and being cast from the synagogue, they refused to confess him. Some believed, but like the devils, they believed, but they wouldn't confess him. Is that saving faith? No, it is not. It is a demonic faith. You see the two differences in faith that people have. Well, something is about to happen to the disciples. In Hebrews 3, verse 18, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see they could not enter in because of unbelief. Do you see what the writer did just here? They couldn't enter in because they didn't obey. Then he said they didn't enter in because of unbelief. You see, he is equating unbelief with disobedience. So if a person doesn't obey, he doesn't believe. That's dead faith. James 2 verse 19, as I've already said, you believe that there's one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? So here we see both phrases used together. Demonic faith and dead faith. Of course, any faith that is separated from working, active, living faith is dead faith and it's demonic. Jesus was crucified, witnessed by probably hundreds, because he was marched through the streets of Jerusalem with part of the cross on his back. As he walked, there would be people that would see him carrying that cross with that sign on it that said the King of the Jews. That's the sign that Pilate put on it. Oh, the Jews didn't like it at all. But he said, what I've written, I have written. And of course, he was marched up to Golgotha, where they're witnessed again by a multitude, including his own family members and including his disciples, where they crucified him. Then they took that lifeless body, having completely expired, put him in a new tomb, a tomb that there was no escaping, a tomb where no one had lain. In this new tomb, they laid the lifeless body of Jesus, and then rolled a large stone over the mouth of the tomb, and then gave it the Roman seal. That seal was to be broken would cause death. Not the seal, but the Roman government. Then 2 guards was placed there. And all of this, they thought their master was dead and would stay dead. Early that Sunday morning, when Mary Magdalene and others came to the tomb, they found a surprise. The stone was moved from the mouth of the tomb, and the body was no longer there. They came back. They told the disciples. Now listen to this. So Mary went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. This is talking about the disciples. When they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. the disciples who had been with Jesus, witnessed his miracles, listened to his teaching, they did not believe. And in fact, in Luke 24, verse 11, they said that their words were idle words. They're like fables. There was no truth to it. They didn't believe to that capacity. In Mark 16, verse 14, later, Jesus would appear to them, and he rebuked the hardness of their heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Jesus expected them to have believed, but they didn't. Even under credible testimony, they didn't believe he had risen from the dead. You know, we talk about Thomas. I want to tell you, all the disciples were guilty of the same thing. Nobody calls them doubting disciples, but they were. Jesus even rebuked them. When he appeared unto Thomas, Thomas said, unless I can touch the scars on his hands and side, I won't believe him. I won't believe that he's raised. Jesus appeared to the disciples. Thomas was with them. He said, okay, Thomas. He didn't have to touch. He said, my Lord and my God. What a noble, wonderful confession. I really hate it that Thomas was stuck with that moniker whenever the other disciples were just as guilty of doubt as he was. And then with such an awesome response to Jesus, my Lord and my God. They were rebuked because they doubted the credible evidence that was presented to them. And they demanded more evidence, like Thomas. It wasn't enough that he had just risen and been seen by the ladies that had come to his tomb. They wanted more evidence. Then was necessary for them to have solid faith. Now, someone has said, well, why do you think they disbelieved? Well, I don't know. Could be a number of reasons. Now, in a minute, I want to show you why they should have believed. But why they didn't believe, maybe it's because of fear. You know, they were very insisting that Jesus not go to Jerusalem. In fact, Peter told him, no, Lord, you're not going to Jerusalem. That's where Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. Because that was his lot. That was his purpose. They were afraid. Now that he's gone, I'm sure they were really afraid because there's that question, what do we do now? He's gone. Preconceived ideas about the Messiah and the kingdom. They thought when the Messiah would come that he would restore the kingdom back to Israel. And in fact, in Acts chapter 1, they asked, one of the last questions they asked Jesus, Lord, at this time will you restore the kingdom back into Israel? Jesus says, not for you to know the times or the epochs. Now I won't tell you. What he told them was, you wait in Jerusalem till you have the power come from on high. That power would represent the entrance of the kingdom. They had preached the first gospel sermon in which those keys that was talked about in Matthew 16, verse 18, the keys of the kingdom, would be used by Peter to unlock the gate of heaven. But they were still looking they had been looking for an earthly kingdom and an earthly Messiah. And they didn't think he would be put to death. Maybe it's because of spiritual blindness. They were just blind to the truth that he had been preaching. For whatever reason, they didn't accept the resurrection. Reasons why they should have believed. This is why they were rebuked. First of all, through his teaching. I mean, for 2.5 years at least, they had heard Jesus' teaching. They witnessed in John the 2nd chapter him telling those individuals in the temple. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. Destroy the temple? John wrote as an addenda that he was talking about his body. Now again, that was after the fact. But he was talking about his body, his death. Also, Matthew 12, verse 40, the Jews were looking for a sign. They were big on signs. So they were looking for a sign. He said, I'm not going to give you a sign but the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now it's getting a little bit more plain now. 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, just like Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. Why didn't they pick up on that? Maybe they did at that time. Now listen to this next one, Mark 8, verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, after 3 days rise again. How could it get any more plain and simple than that? This was the kind of teaching that they were hearing from the Master. And yet 3 days after his death, they don't believe he's raised. Until they went to the tomb and saw the empty tomb themselves. But the point is, Jesus rebuked them for their unbelief, because they should have believed. Folks, let me tell you something. There is no excuse for disbelief today, because we have these things that we've been talking about in this Word. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that this is His Word, then you're going to believe that He raised from the dead. I cannot believe today the number of religious organizations that deny the resurrection of Christ. They do not deny His existence, but they deny His resurrection. How dare them? They witnessed His power over death. I mean, they were there whenever the widow of Nain's son had died. And when Jesus come across the funeral, you know, He broke up several funerals. He raised that widow's son from the dead, which they saw that. And then there was Lazarus, who had been dead and buried for 4 days. In other words, in that arid atmosphere, his body was already going through the decaying process. And now that body comes struggling out of the tomb, wrapped in its grave linen. They witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus. They knew they had the power over life and death, but yet they didn't believe when He raised from the dead. How about His perfect life? His perfect life. That should have demonstrated something peculiar and different about Christ. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. The prophets. They heard the prophets. Now, they understood the sacrifices. The sacrifices was going to be without blemish, without spot. The choicest of the flock was the proper sacrifice. That That would have been Christ, who had no sin, who knew no sin. Look at Psalm 53, starting verse 7. Psalm 53 and verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He's talking about the suffering servant. Everyone understood that this would have been the Messiah. The apostles had to have heard this 1,000 times, give or take 999, in the synagogue. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was put to death. A sacrificial death, like a lamb to its slaughter. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Beautiful imagery of the death of Christ. They had to have known that one. Or there's Psalm 16:10. For you will not leave my soul in hell, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. They understood that as the grave. In fact, Peter will quote that one in the book of Acts, chapter 2. They had all of these reasons to believe and should have believed, but they didn't. Now, with credible evidence, there comes incredible faith. As we go along, things are going to change immensely. First of all, the first credible evidence was the empty tomb. When the disciples came, there was nobody in that tomb. The very tomb in which they had laid Christ was now empty. Except, and this is more proof, the burial attire, the wrappings of the burial for the body was folded and sat in the corner with or sat on the in the tomb with a head napkin on its top. Now I want you to think about that. There's another proof here. How did the stone get moved? There's another proof here. What about those two soldiers standing on the outside? That resurrection, the empty tomb itself, is one of the most credible evidences of the resurrection of Christ that there is. And then you have the appearance of the angels. He said, why seek ye the Christ? Or why you seek the living among the dead? See, he's not here. You know that had to change the mindset of these individuals, these disciples. As a result, that empty tomb, and again, the only way that could happen is by miracle. That stone was heavy enough that a weak individual could not move it, which the Passover plot has Christ only passing out on the cross. And so they put him in the tomb for 3 days, and he woke up and he moved the tomb and scared everybody to death. Come on now. Come on now. That's an impossibility. When you think of the things that Jesus went through, the amount of blood he lost, the sword through the side, the lashes that he took, there's no way that could have ever happened. You know, the body was never found. It was seen, but it was never found after the ascension. Flesh and blood cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. So we know that he didn't go to heaven in his physical body. Something happened to it. Well, some people say the disciples stole it. Makes perfect sense. Well, that's what the guards were there for. Remember the Roman seal? You know, this is something interesting to me. The enemies gave credit to what Jesus said, because they said, this man said after 3 days he would be raised. They remembered that. The disciples, I guess, forgot. So we need to put a guard on it and the seal. Pilate said, take care of it. That body was gone from the grave. Now, let's say the disciples had stolen it. I wonder what would have happened whenever the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 9, when the persecutions among the Jews started against the church, and they that were scattered abroad preaching the word. I wonder why that body wasn't presented then by the disciples, if they stole it. Just think of all the lives that was lost or imprisoned had Jesus been a fraud, or had the disciples stolen the body, or even the enemies. Why wouldn't the enemies have brought the bodies to see? Here's this man that you are serving. They could have stopped the whole belief system of Christians if they had just presented the body. But there was no body to present. The body was gone. Never found. And by the way, just a side note, I've mentioned this before, but I want to remind you something. You've probably heard of the Shroud of Turin. That's the biggest joke out there. You remember what I said about the grave linen? If you'll notice, it's all one piece, including the head wrappings. It's all part of the body. That's not the way it happened, according to the New Testament. But anyway, I get a little frustrated at the lengths people will go to appear religious. The body was never found. Now all of a sudden, these scared, weak, unbelieving disciples now are standing before multitudes and preaching. 3,000 day of Pentecost. 5,000 the next day in Jerusalem. 8,000 souls were brought to Christ through their preaching. They had a boldness that had returned to them. A power of conviction that had returned. Their belief now is an incredible faith. And they're teaching and preaching, and they're being persecuted. They're being beaten. They're being stoned. They've been brought before the tribunal, and they keep teaching and preaching. They believed that he was raised from the dead. They believed because they saw him. They saw the empty tomb. And because of that belief, they had the courage. And then there were the appearances. The appearances. First of all, he appeared, Mark 16, verse 9, to Mary Magdalene. Then, in John 20, Jesus appears, by the way, upon the first day of the week. His appearances were on the first day of the week. Isn't that amazing? The same day that we're commanded to come forward and have the Lord's Supper, Jesus was appearing to the disciples. He appeared to the 11 without Thomas. John 20, 19, 20. Then he appeared to the 11 with Thomas. Matthew 28, 16, 17. Then they were fishing by the Sea of Tiberias, and Jesus came to them. John 21, verses 1 through 10. Now, I want you to watch this. In fact, turn over to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15. We're talking about his appearances now, the people that he showed and revealed himself to. 1 Corinthians 15, I'm going to start reading at verse 5. And that he was seen by Cephas, or Peter, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to this present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me, also as one born out of due time. Now, I want you to think about the 500 for a minute. Any one of them could have come up and said, this is bogus information. That man did not rise from the dead. We didn't see him. Some of them were still alive. They heard the preaching of Peter and John. There was no denying what happened. These 500 themselves, not just the disciples, but these 500 have a credible testimony that can produce an incredible faith because they conferred with the apostles and backed up their story. And then, of course, there was a man by the name of Saul of Tarsus. Saul, who was a persecutor of the way of the church, a man who was white hot in his vindictive spirit toward those who believed in Christ. On his way to Damascus, he saw Jesus. It changed him from Saul the persecutor to Paul the preacher. He became a missionary to the Gentiles, and there's no way on this earth the man Saul of Tarsus would have ever gone to the Gentiles, because they were considered as dogs and the scum of the earth. And the law prevented them from going to these outsiders. But he became a chosen vessel of God to go to the Gentiles. And then he writes, I become all things to all men. The Jew, I become a Jew. The Gentile, I become a Gentile. That I might win some and preach the gospel. You see, Jesus, number one, his resurrection is founded upon credible evidence. Evidence that to this day stands unharmed. Oh, people have tried to dismiss it, but the evidence is too strong. First of all, we know that he existed. We know of his life from a historian viewpoint. We also know that he was put to death from a historian viewpoint. After that, we depend on inspiration. You said, is that enough? It's more than enough. Because that inspiration is based on God's revelation. From the prophecies of the prophets all the way back to the very beginning, whenever man sinned, and God revealed for the first time his plan to stomp the head of the snake, the old serpent, Satan, with the heel of his son. Now, as he told Thomas of old, Thomas, you believe because you see, but blessed are those, more blessed are those who believe and has never seen. That's us. Our faith is incredible. But our faith is based on credible evidence. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, I encourage you to reconsider your life and what Christ would want you to do. And make that decision to come forward, be baptized, have your sins remitted, washed away. If you have let the Lord down in your life, not been the kind of Christian that He would have you to be, then perhaps we can help you with that decision to return through prayer. If you have a need, we'd encourage you to come while we stand and sing together.